The war room of the hegemony flagship, inevitable dominion, hummed with the kind of self-satisfied energy that only comes from beings who have never encountered a problem they couldn't solve by throwing superior technology at it. Holographic displays painted the darkness in shades of blue and amber, each dot representing fleets, worlds, and the mathematical certainty of victory over the upstart species that had dared to exist without permission. Commander Vexthul of the Chronari Empire adjusted his ceremonial battle crest, a ridiculously ornate affair that suggested someone had crossbred a peacock with a military insignia and then added entirely too many gems. Around the central tactical table, representatives from 7 different species maintained the kind of posture that screamed, "We are very important and definitely know what we're doing." The hegemony had been expanding across the galaxy for 3 millennia, absorbing civilizations with the casual efficiency of a cosmic vacuum cleaner, and they had the track record to prove it. "The human resistance continues to be inconvenient," announced General Koros, whose forearms gestured at the display with the sort of dramatic flair that suggested he'd practiced this moment in front of a mirror. His species, the Vorthok, had conquered 47 star systems before breakfast on their worst day. "Humans, by all calculations, should have been extinct 6 months ago." "Inconvenient," scoffed Admiral Zinn, her crystalline features catching the light in a way that would have been beautiful if not for the underlying expression of contempt. The ethereal collective had perfected warfare to an art form, literally. They wrote poetry about their victories and sang operas about their strategic brilliance. These mammals possess crude vessels, primitive weapons, and tactical systems that would embarrass a first-year military academy student. Yet somehow they continue to breathe. The irony, of course, was entirely lost on them. Here sat beings who could manipulate dark matter, fold space-time like origami, and calculate the orbital mechanics of entire star systems in their heads, puzzled by creatures who had only recently figured out how to leave their own solar system without exploding. It was rather like watching chess grandmasters scratch their heads over a game of tic-tac-toe, except the tic-tac-toe was winning. "Perhaps," suggested Colonel Morthan with the kind of reasonable tone that indicated he was about to say something profoundly stupid, "we should consult a consultant." Ah yes, the consultant. The human they'd captured 3 weeks ago during the failed siege of the Luna defensive grid. Intelligence had identified her as a strategic advisor to the human military command, though her rank insignia had been removed and her files suspiciously clean. The hegemony, in their infinite wisdom, had decided that keeping her alive might provide insight into human tactical thinking, because clearly the best way to understand your enemy was to ask them nicely to explain their weakness. She sat in the corner of the war room, apparently more interested in examining her fingernails than in the fate of her species. The restraint field around her chair glowed softly, a precaution that seemed increasingly unnecessary, given her complete lack of interest in escape attempt. Her dark hair had been pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her expression suggested she was mentally elsewhere, perhaps contemplating grocery lists, or wondering if she'd left the stove on before being abducted by Galactic overlords. "Human," barked Vexthul, because apparently using actual names was beneath beings who could communicate through quantum entanglement. "Your people continue to resist our inevitable victory. Explain this illogical behavior." She looked up with the mild interest of someone who'd been asked about the weather. "You want me to explain why people don't want to die?" "Your resistance is futile," General Koros declared, gesturing grandly at the tactical display. "Our forces outnumber yours 50 to 1. Our technology surpasses yours by millennia. Our strategic capabilities are unmatched in galactic history. Yet you persist in this meaningless struggle." "Meaningful is relative," she replied, finally showing enough interest to stand and approach the holographic battle. The restraint field moved with her, a glowing bubble that made her look like a very bored snow globe ornament. "Mind if I take a look at your battle plans?" The assembled commanders exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey both superiority and curiosity. Admiral Zinn waved a crystalline hand. "By all means, perhaps when you see the scope of our strategic superiority, you will counsel your species toward a more sensible surrender." The human stepped closer to the central display, her eyes moving across the 3-dimensional battlefield with professional interest. Fleet positions, supply lines, defensive installations, projected attack vectors, everything laid out in perfect detail by beings who had been perfecting the art of conquest since before her species had discovered fire. She studied the map for perhaps 30 seconds, her expression shifting from casual interest to something that might have been amusement. Then she smiled, not the desperate grin of someone facing impossible odds, but the quiet, satisfied smile of someone who had just figured out the punchline to a very good joke. "This is your master strategy?" she asked, her tone carrying just enough disbelief to be insulting without being overtly rude. "Your grand plan for crushing humanity. It is flawless," Vexthul proclaimed, his battle crest fluffing with indignation. She tilted her head, considering the holographic display with the air of someone examining a particularly interesting puzzle. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable before she spoke again, her voice carrying that peculiar mix of respect and condescension that suggested she was explaining something to very bright children who had missed an obvious point. "Should I win the war," she said quietly, still smiling at the map, "or make it last?" The silence that followed her question had the peculiar weight of beings who suspected they'd just been insulted but couldn't quite figure out how. It was the cosmic equivalent of that moment when you realize the helpful stranger giving you directions might have just sent you to a very inconvenient place, but you're too polite to question their expertise until you're already hopelessly lost. "Elaborate," Admiral Zinn demanded, her crystalline features arranging themselves into what passed for stern authority among beings who communicated through harmonic resonance. The human gestured toward the tactical display with the casual air of someone critiquing a restaurant menu. "Well, your current approach is certainly thorough. Overwhelm with superior numbers, crush all resistance through technological advantage, accept surrender, move on to the next target. Very efficient. Very predictable." General Karos preened slightly. "Predictable implies reliability. We have conquered using these methods for 3,000 years. Exactly my point." She circled the holographic battlefield, her restraint field casting odd shadows through the projections. "You've been doing the same thing for 3 millennia, against species who think exactly like you do. But humans," she paused, tapping her temple with one finger, "we're not particularly bright, but we're phenomenally stubborn. And we learn." Commander Vexthul's battle crest twitched with annoyance. "What do you suggest?" The question hung in the recycled air of the command center like an invitation to a particularly elaborate practical joke. Here were beings whose strategic algorithms could calculate the probability of victory across 17 different variables simultaneously, asking advice from a species that had recently discovered faster-than-light travel by essentially strapping rockets to their ships and hoping for the best. "Your main assault vector," she began, pointing to the central thrust of their attack formation, "is mathematically sound but psychologically flawed. You're hitting our strongest defensive positions first, which forces us to commit our best resources immediately. Very sporting of you, but it gives us time to adapt." The assembled commanders leaned forward with the eager attention of students discovering a new theorem. This was perhaps the most dangerous moment in the history of galactic warfare. The instant when overwhelming superiority decided to take notes from desperate improvisation. "Instead," she continued, warming to her theme with the enthusiasm of someone explaining a particularly clever card trick, "you should feint toward our major defensive installations while actually targeting these secondary positions." Her finger traced lines across the display, highlighting supply depots, communication relays, and seemingly insignificant outposts. "Hit the infrastructure first. Make us scramble. Force us to react instead of respond." Colonel Morthan's sensory apparatus flickered with interest. "This would delay victory, would it not?" "Oh, absolutely," she agreed with cheerful candor. "But it would make the victory more complete, more educational. Break their morale along with their defense. When you finally do strike the main targets, they'll fold immediately instead of mounting a costly resistance." It was beautiful, really. Like watching a master chef prepare a meal by carefully explaining each step to someone who was determined to cook with explosive. Every word was technically accurate, every suggestion tactically sound, and every recommendation precisely calculated to achieve the exact opposite of its stated purpose. Admiral Zinn's harmonic frequencies shifted to what passed for thoughtful consideration among her species. "Your humans would abandon their outer colonies to preserve their core worlds." Without hesitation, she lied with the confident ease of someone selling ice to polar bears. "We're not sentimental about territory. We can always build new colonies, but lose Earth, Luna, and Mars, and there's no human civilization left to rebuild." The truth, of course, was precisely the reverse. Humans would fight for every inhabited rock in space with the ferocity of rabid badgers. But they'd also evacuate civilians, relocate resources, and turn every abandoned position into a trap that would make a black hole look hospitable. Hit the outer colonies first, and you'd give humanity time to prepare surprises that would make the current resistance look like a polite disagreement. But the hegemony commanders nodded with the satisfaction of beings who had just learned something profound about their primitive enemy. General Koros began highlighting targets on the tactical display, his forearms moving with practiced efficiency as he incorporated her suggestions into their battle plan. This approach, Vexthul mused, would also allow us to test their response patterns without committing our primary assault forces. Precisely, she agreed, managing to sound impressed by his tactical insight. You could observe how they adapt, learn their new strategies, and counter them before the main engagement. It's like having a practice round. The irony was exquisite. Here were beings whose idea of warfare had been perfected through conquering species that fought exactly like they did. Organized, logical, and thoroughly predictable. They understood the mathematics of overwhelming force, the efficiency of technological superiority, and the psychology of inevitable defeat. What they didn't understand was the human tendency to view impossible odds as a personal challenge, rather than a mathematical certainty. Over the next several hours, she helped them refine their strategy with the patient enthusiasm of someone teaching calculus to enthusiastic toddlers. She suggested optimal timing for their feints, recommended vulnerable-looking targets that would require maximum effort to capture, and even advised them on the best way to coordinate their multi-species fleet movements for maximum visual impact. Every suggestion was tactically brilliant, strategically sound, and operationally disastrous. She was essentially teaching them to fight the war they wanted to fight instead of the war they needed to fight, and they were taking note. By the time the strategy session concluded, the hegemony had completely restructured their assault plan based on her recommendation. They would begin with coordinated strikes against outer colony defensive positions, force humanity to reveal their adaptive strategies, and then crush them with overwhelming force applied to their core worlds. It was a plan that made perfect sense to beings who had spent 3 millennia winning through mathematical certainty. It would also give humanity exactly what they needed most: time, warning, and the opportunity to demonstrate why adaptation was more valuable than calculation. As the commanders dispersed to implement their new strategy, she settled back into her chair with the contented expression of someone who had just finished a particularly satisfying crossword puzzle. The restraint field hummed quietly around her, a gentle reminder that she was technically still a prisoner. She looked at the updated tactical display one more time, smiled quietly to herself, and began considering whether the war should end quickly, or whether these poor doomed creatures deserved a more thorough education in the difference between intelligence and cleverness. 3 weeks into their brilliantly redesigned campaign, the hegemony discovered that victory had developed an unfortunate habit of feeling suspiciously like defeat. It began with small inconsistencies, reconnaissance drones that reported empty facilities which then exploded with remarkable enthusiasm when the main fleet arrived, supply convoys that vanished into hyperspace, only to reappear behind enemy lines, and defensive installations that seemed to multiply like cosmic rabbits every time they were supposedly destroyed. Commander Vexthul stood before the tactical display in what could generously be described as a state of barely controlled bewilderment. His ceremonial battle crest had begun molting from stress, leaving small decorative feathers scattered around his station like the remnants of a very disappointed peacock. The holographic battlefield now resembled less a coordinated assault and more a three-dimensional representation of entropy having a particularly creative day. "Explain to me," he said with the careful tone of someone trying not to admit they'd been outsmarted by their lunch, "how we have destroyed 17 human defensive installations, captured 43 strategic positions, and eliminated roughly 30% of their outer fleet, yet somehow find ourselves in a tactically inferior position." The assembled commanders exchanged the sort of glances typically reserved for beings who had just discovered that their supposedly foolproof plan had been designed by actual fools. Admiral Zin's crystalline features had taken on a distinctly dull luster, while General Karos seemed to be developing a nervous tic in his third arm. "The humans appear to be adapting more rapidly than anticipated," reported Colonel Morthan, his sensory apparatus flickering with what could only be described as electronic anxiety. Each position we capture requires progressively more resources to hold, and our supply lines are experiencing unexplained difficulty. Unexplained difficulties. That was certainly one way to describe the phenomenon wherein hegemony supply convoys kept encountering what appeared to be empty space that subsequently revealed itself to be full of very motivated humans, with explosives and a questionable relationship with the concept of self-preservation. The human consultant sat in her corner, still enclosed in her restraint field, apparently absorbed in examining the structural integrity of her thumbnail. She had developed the unsettling habit of humming quietly to herself during tactical briefings, usually selections that sounded suspiciously cheerful given the circumstances. Perhaps, suggested Admiral Zinn with the desperate optimism of someone clinging to a life preserver made of wishful thinking, our consultant might provide additional insight into human tactical evolution. The woman looked up with the mild surprise of someone who had been thinking about something far more interesting than galactic warfare. "Oh, you're still having trouble with the outer colony." General Karos gestured at the display with all four arms, creating a spectacle that resembled an octopus attempting to conduct a very frustrated orchestra. "Your species continues to resist despite suffering catastrophic losses. According to all mathematical models, they should have surrendered by now." Mathematical models, she repeated thoughtfully, as if contemplating a particularly abstract philosophical concept. "Yes, I can see how those would be confusing when applied to humans." The pause that followed had the quality of beings who suspected they were about to receive very bad news but weren't quite ready to admit it to themselves. "You see," she continued with the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts to exceptionally bright children, "your models assume rational behavior. Humans aren't particularly rational. We're emotional, stubborn, and we have this odd tendency to get more creative when things look hopeless." Commander Vexthul's remaining battle crest feathers began to vibrate with agitation. "Creativity is not a military asset, isn't it?" She stood and approached the tactical display, her restraint field painting everything in soft blue light as she moved. "Take your attack on the Proxima station. Textbook assault, perfect execution, overwhelming force. You captured it in 6 hours. A complete success," General Karos declared with waning confidence. "Absolute, except that while you were capturing an empty station filled with holographic projectors and about 3 tons of industrial-grade explosives, the actual Proxima garrison was busy capturing your forward supply depot in the Centauri system." She pointed to a sector that had until recently been colored green for secure hegemony territory, and was now blinking an alarming shade of red. The silence that followed could have been weaponized and deployed against enemy morale. "The humans you were fighting weren't defending Proxima Station," she continued conversationally. "They were buying time for their friends to steal your ammunition, which they then used to destroy your reinforcement fleet when it arrived, which forced you to divert resources from the main assault to protect your supply lines, which gave Earth's defensive fleet time to relocate and reorganize. It's really quite elegant when you think about it." Admiral Zinn's harmonic frequencies had shifted to what sounded distinctly like the galactic equivalent of hyperventilation. "You are suggesting that every victory we have achieved has been anticipated." "Oh, not just anticipated. Orchestrated." The human's smile had evolved from mild amusement to something that might have been described as predatory if she hadn't looked so perfectly relaxed. "You've been fighting exactly the war we wanted you to fight, exactly the way we needed you to fight it." The revelation hit the assembled commanders with the force of a collapsing star. 3 weeks of tactical brilliance, strategic superiority, and overwhelming technological advantage had apparently been nothing more than an elaborate dance choreographed by the species they were supposedly conquering. But Vexthul's voice cracked with the sound of a worldview experiencing catastrophic structural failure. "Our strategy was flawless. You helped design it." "I did indeed," she agreed cheerfully. "I suggested you attack the outer colonies first, remember? Drain your resources fighting empty installations while the real defenses consolidated around Earth. I recommended you test human adaptive capabilities, which gave us plenty of time to analyze your tactics and develop counters. I even advised you on fleet coordination, which made it much easier for our scouts to predict your movement patterns." The tactical display flickered as new information cascaded across its surface. Human fleets that had supposedly been destroyed were reappearing in impossible positions. Defensive installations that had been marked as captured were somehow operational again. Supply lines that had been secure were now contested by forces that shouldn't have existed.
This is impossible, General Karos whispered, his forearms hanging limply at his sides. We are the hegemony. We have conquered 47 star systems. We do not lose to primitive species with obsolete technology. You're absolutely right, she replied with genuine sympathy. You don't lose to species like that. You lose to species like... She gestured toward the display, where the tactical situation was rapidly transforming from challenging but manageable to mathematically impossible but apparently happening anyway. The difference, she continued, settling back into her chair with the satisfied air of someone whose job was nearly finished, is that those other 47 civilizations fought you the way you expected to be fought. They used superior tactics, advanced technology, and logical strategy. All things you could counter with even more superior tactics, more advanced technology, and more logical strategy. The restraint field hummed quietly around her, a gentle reminder that she was still technically their prisoner. Humans don't fight that way. We cheat. We use your strengths against you and turn your advantages into liabilities. We make you think you're winning right up until the moment you realize you've already lost. She looked around at the collection of beings who had just discovered that their 3,000-year winning streak was about to come to a very abrupt end. And the best part, we learned all of this from you. The coup de grace arrived exactly 47 minutes later, delivered with the punctuality of a species that had apparently scheduled the complete destruction of galactic order for mid-afternoon. The tactical display transformed into a light show that would have been spectacular if it hadn't represented the systematic annihilation of everything the hegemony had considered mathematically certain about warfare. Human fleets materialized from hyperspace with the casual efficiency of commuters arriving at work. Except these particular commuters had brought enough firepower to sterilize solar systems in the demonstrated willingness to use it creatively. They appeared not in the predicted locations where the hegemony's hastily repositioned forces waited, but in the exact positions that would cause maximum psychological damage while requiring minimum actual effort. Commander Vexthal watched his flagship's sister ship, the Guaranteed Victory, become a brief star in the darkness as its reactor core experienced what the tactical computer diplomatically termed unexpected operational termination. His remaining battle crest feathers molted in real time, creating a small blizzard of decorative plumage that somehow made the bridge look even more pathetic. They're not even trying, Admiral Zinn observed with the hollow voice of someone whose entire understanding of reality had been fed through a cosmic shredder. Her crystalline features had gone completely opaque, a defensive mechanism that occurred when her species encountered concepts too disturbing to process consciously. Look at their attack patterns. They're barely using a tenth of their available firepower. Indeed, the human assault had the leisurely quality of beings who were conducting a military exercise rather than fighting for their species' survival. Chips that could have been vaporized immediately were instead disabled with surgical precision. Installations that could have been obliterated were captured intact. It was warfare conducted with the casual competence of professionals who were no longer particularly interested in the challenge. The woman in the restraint field had stopped humming and was now watching the proceedings with the detached interest of someone observing a mildly engaging sporting event. There was something almost anticlimactic about her expression, as if the complete reversal of galactic power dynamics had turned out to be slightly less entertaining than she'd hoped. "Magnificent," General Koros whispered, his forearms hanging limp as he contemplated the tactical display. "They could have destroyed us at any point in the last 3 weeks. They were simply playing with us." "Not playing," she corrected with the gentle tone of someone providing a technical clarification. Your invasion was basically a very expensive education program designed to teach humanity how to fight opponents with overwhelming technological superiority. Congratulations, by the way. Excellent teacher." The bridge fell silent except for the gentle hum of life support systems and the occasional explosion visible through the viewports, as another hegemony vessel discovered that its shields were not in fact proof against weapons that had been specifically designed to counter them. Colonel Morton's sensory apparatus flickered weakly. What happens now? It was perhaps the most important question in galactic history, posed by beings who had just discovered that their 3,000-year reign as the dominant military force had been terminated by a species that had been spacefaring for less than 2 centuries. The answer would determine whether the hegemony continued to exist as anything more than a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming your own superiority. The human stood and approached the tactical display one final time, her restraint field casting familiar blue shadows across the holographic representation of humanity's total victory. She studied the battlefield with the same professional interest she'd shown 3 weeks earlier, when the assembled commanders had been so eager to demonstrate their strategic brilliance. "You know," she said conversationally, "I could end this quickly. Send the surrender terms, accept your unconditional capitulation, move on to establishing a new galactic order. Very efficient, very humane considering." Commander Vexthul's species had evolved from predatory pack hunters, and some ancestral instinct warned him that he was about to hear something that would make his current situation seem pleasant by comparison. "Or," she continued, her smile returning with the warmth of a star-going supernova, "I could let this play out naturally. Watch your remaining fleets surrender one by one as they realize the mathematical impossibility of victory. Observe your subject species declare independence, as they recognize that the mighty hegemony has been outmaneuvered by primitives with obsolete technology. Document the complete collapse of galactic civilization, as everyone scrambles to align themselves with the new dominant power." The pause that followed had the weight of civilizations hanging in the balance. The first option would take maybe 6 hours, she mused, apparently conducting some internal calculation. The second could last months, years even, depending on how stubborn your outlying territories decide to be about accepting reality. Admiral Zin's harmonic frequencies shifted to what might have been described as desperate hope. "And which do you choose?" The woman looked at the tactical display one last time, her expression cycling through what might have been amusement, satisfaction, and finally something that looked suspiciously like boredom. The complete conquest of galactic civilization had apparently lost its appeal sometime between the third and fourth impossible human victory. "You know what?" she said, her tone carrying the casual dismissal of someone who had grown tired of playing with toys that broke too easily. "I think I'll end it quickly. Not because you deserve mercy, but because dragging this out would just be tedious at this point." She turned to face the assembled commanders with the patient expression of someone about to explain something very simple to beings who had proven themselves spectacularly incapable of understanding basic concepts. "Besides," she added with a smile that somehow managed to be both compassionate and utterly ruthless, "we've already proven our point. The galaxy has a new dominant species, and it's not the one with the biggest ships or the most advanced technology. It's the one that looked at your perfect strategy, figured out how to turn it into a weapon against you, and then used your own superiority complex to destroy everything you thought you knew about warfare." The tactical display flickered one final time, as human forces moved into position around the remaining hegemony vessel. The war that had been designed to demonstrate alien superiority was about to end, with humanity dictating terms to beings who had considered themselves the apex of galactic evolution.
She looked at the map, smiled one last time, and reached for the communication console to begin transmitting surrender terms. After all, she had made her choice weeks ago, standing in this very room, examining their flawless battle plans with professional interest. She had looked at the map, smiled, and decided that winning the war would be more satisfying than making it last. The punchline, as it turned out, was that she had been right.